Welcome back to CrimsonCast, Gale and Clavio, midweek edition, joining you here. It is Wednesday, October 29th, and I'm going to say right up front, if you're coming for IU football coverage, we're not talking about IU football today, so you can effectively skip this one if you want to, but we try every once in a while on the show to bring in some different topics, some things that are going on in the sports world that I know are of interest to the fans out there, even if they might not necessarily tie directly in to IU football. And that's what this is one of those episodes. So we will have our normal football preview episode coming up here probably tomorrow, maybe Friday. So keep an eye out on the feed for that. But we have our ace producing and occasional on-air team from Big Red Carpet, Peter Maiorano and Nathan Shriberg, joining us. Guys, how you doing? Good to see you.
Pretty good, man.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's a miserable weather day here in Bloomington today. It was everything. Those who have been watching or listening to the pod for a while know my feelings on fall. When I think of fall, I don't think of those lovely, sun-soaked Sundays where you're like strolling through a pumpkin patch or like picking apples off a tree in the sunshine. I think about this: cold, wet, rainy, completely no sunshine, seasonal affective disorder just coming at you, dropping on your head like an anvil. That's what today was. Guys, did you enjoy it?
I mean, that's what it sounds like right now from my room. So
yeah,
it was not fun.
No. So anyway, that's the mood we're in as we get this thing started. But we're going to talk actually about this gambling scandal that is threatening to engulf the NBA, because there's some college spillover, but there's also a kind of a conceptual idea here, as we've now seen the NCAA maybe backtrack a little bit on this idea that they're going to let college athletes and college coaches bet on professional sports. And so when the news broke over the weekend about the NBA related stuff, Peter and Nathan and I talked about, hey, we should do a show about this, some kind of a podcast. So that's what this is. So we're going to talk about that. We got some questions we want to delve into and just some general ideas about how all this fits, whether we need to be worried about it at the college level, and just kind of generally speaking where we're at with everything. So we'll get to that. First of all, quick reminder, we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, who when you buy from Home Field Apparel, you're not gambling. You are getting the best in apparel across all of the college landscape and occasionally even beyond that, as my Men in Blazers Courage crew neck would indicate. But Home Field Apparel, your place to go for all kinds of amazing hoodies, T-shirts, crew necks, jackets, a little bit of everything. Many IU fans in the audience, and obviously they aim right at your heart, but they also aim at the hearts of people across the college sports landscape and even in some cases the professional landscape. Go to homefieldapparel.com and just walk right through their amazing expansive storefront with all of the different things that you can order. If you use the code HOME23, you get 15% off your first order. Again, homefieldapparel.com. Go check them out. Let them know that we sent you. Use that code HOME23 and get yourself something nice. Keep yourself warm in conditions like this. All right. Guys, let's dive into it. Ultimately, as we roll into the topic of this, we need to kind of start, I think, by establishing some of the conceptual items that make up this situation. So there's two different things at play. And I think one of the issues that we ran into when we were first talking about this issue is that there's kind of two completely separate things going on with this NBA indictment simultaneously. And calling it an NBA indictment is not right. It's really an indictment from the FBI that happens to involve NBA people. But it does kind of feel like the league is right in the crosshairs of all of this because of the people involved and because of what's being talked about around all of this. So two separate threads starting right off. We've got at the center of it two people in particular. One of them, Terry Rozier, who played for the Heat, played for the Hornets, who essentially has been accused of either informing people that he was planning on being injured during games, which allowed them to bet on the wrong side, or the right side, I guess, as the case would be, of his player props. And then we've also got Chauncey Billups, the now suspended without pay head coach of the Portland Trailblazers, who was already a source of controversy, given some things in his past, who both apparently, according to the indictment, nothing's been proven in court yet, was both operating as a front man for a rigged poker game run by the mafia. That's try to get that all in your head. But also, even though he wasn't directly named, appears to be a co-conspirator in a plan to provide injury information to gamblers so that they could bet more effectively on games, especially towards the end of the season, involving the team that he was coaching. So there's a lot to unpack with all of that. I asked the guys to kind of send me some questions ahead of time so we could try to work it out. And of course, they sent me some great questions that are all over the map. I don't even know where we want to begin with this. One of you, I don't care which one, maybe Nathan, let's start with you.
All right.
The beginnings of all of this, what you've learned so far, what you've read, what's the most pressing question you have about where all of this lands and what we should think about it?
Well, I think service level, going back to last month, we thought we had an earth-shattering scandal with Kawhi Leonard and the Clippers and Steve Ballmer and aspiration, and now we have the mafia involved. So I think it's been taken to a whole new level than we thought was possible. And I think maybe the first question we should entertain is what happens at the end of all of this?
Yeah.
How exactly does the league go about doling out punishments? How do you assign the weight to this versus we just saw someone banned for life for things not coming close to these allegations last year, Jonte Porter? It's kind of just big picture. What does the league do? How does Adam Silver handle this?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And yeah, bringing up the aspiration stuff with the Clippers is a great entree because that did seem like an earth-shattering story that was almost being underreported by most media sources. Pablo Torre, big hats off to him for the investigative journalism that he and his crew have done and the masterful way that he has used his podcast to kind of slowly maneuver people into making really stupid public statements just so he could then later demonstrate, wow, that was a stupid public statement, and here's why. For those who are not caught up on the aspiration story, the allegation is essentially that this company, Aspiration, was like selling tree planting as a carbon offset mechanism, but it was really almost a Ponzi scheme of sorts, and they were in cahoots, according to Torre's reporting, with the Clippers and Steve Ballmer to pay Kawhi Leonard a guaranteed amount of money that essentially circumvented the salary cap rules that are supposed to prevent that kind of thing from occurring. This was something that, frankly, the NBA almost looked like it was trying to sweep under the rug a bit. And, we've seen prominent current and former NBA officials coming out and saying, well, this was not that big of a deal, or the Clippers got scammed. Steve Ballmer got scammed. Everybody's innocent here. This is all the Aspiration's fault. And a lot of people didn't believe them. But it was kind of in neutral because the NBA was supposedly investigating all of this. And then this comes out. And, anytime, I think we've learned over the course of the last 15 years, especially, anytime the FBI feels compelled to arrest people that are associated with your association and then hold a press conference and release an indictment document that lays out in gory detail how your employees or your connected people are collaborating with organized crime, it's generally a bad sign for your organization. I don't know that we can get to what the NBA does, like how they dole out punishment on all of this, because I don't know that the NBA is like has any sense of direction with this right now, because you're dealing with a couple of things that don't really get talked about a lot when you talk about professional sports and how you deal with crisis. Most of the time, we are used to crisis being this player, hit someone with their car, or this coach or this team did something that circumvented our rules as a league. And so then we have to dole out the punishment. When you get into the FBI and organized crime and all of these things, you kind of leap into a new era that most leagues don't have a great way of dealing with. And I think for the NBA, the problem is it's multifold. A, you've already got this suspicion that the NBA doesn't really operate in an above-board capacity when it comes to the way that it handles its players, the way it handles its franchises. It seems to play favorites. It seems to ignore things that are real considerations to fans, something as simple as load management or what networks your games are on and whether it's easy or hard for people to watch. So when you get something like this, where it's like information is being passed along by players or by coaches that would lead people to gamble one way or another on particular outcomes, that strikes at the very integrity of the games, which has always been what all these sports leagues have said over and over again is the most important thing to them. And it's why sports leagues fought so hard against legalized gambling around sports specifically. And that, I think, is the real problem because, like, we always ask these questions, and even the NCAA related items that don't really tie to this but do at the same time. Why did all of these sports leagues, once gambling was legal, suddenly hop into bed with the sports books? And it's largely because it's the most ready source of revenue available in a business environment that is shrinking in terms of available revenue, with a business model that relies on increasing revenues on a regular basis. So on the one hand, you have to work with the sports books because you don't have much of a choice. And on the other hand, you have to ensure that the public's perception of your games is that they are above board and that they can wager on the events without feeling like they're going to get cheated because someone has information that they don't. But you also have to walk a fine line. And I think the NBA did this with the Tim Donaghy scandal, where they had a referee who was accused accurately, as it turned out, of fixing games. They managed to somehow make everybody believe that one guy, Tim Donaghy, was the only guy engaged in the process. I don't know how easily you can do that when you now have Jonte Porter, who you mentioned, who was banned for life last year around this. You have Terry Rozier, who's facing similar punishment. You have Chauncey Billups, who's coaching, who is not only likely, based upon reading the indictment, tied in with giving insider information, but is also tied in with the mafia in unrelated things. And you have strong allegations that other former NBA players are also tied in to those mafia-related allegations. I don't know that there's a clear answer, Nathan. I think it's a lot of this is the NBA. This may be one of those situations where Adam Silver can't maneuver himself out of it because it requires at some point somebody taking the fall. And because Silver, much like David Stern before him, puts himself forward as the person running the league, I don't know that there's a person you can point to and say, we had no idea, because this does not look like something that they had no idea about, especially since there's rumors that they did have an idea about Terry Rozier last year and did nothing about it.
Yeah, I think it was from maybe Rozier's lawyers, if I'm remembering correctly, that said that Adam Silver told them that the league conducted their own investigation and it cleared Rozier.
Right.
Meanwhile, the FBI is still investigating, and it's certainly not cleared him.
Well, they didn't say cleared. They said no evidence.
Well, big difference there. But
Right.
I will note that this is where all of the implications of this, we do need to keep in mind that, 7-8 years ago, the FBI came out with this big announcement of indictments in college basketball about money being paid to induce recruits and Adidas being involved and all of this stuff. And you had some initial fallout. And then, as it turned out, there wasn't enough to actually put a lot of people in jail. A couple of people went to jail. Book Richardson went to jail at Arizona, but that was largely because he was the only guy they could pin anything on. So the FBI does like to have these press conferences where they make it seem like this is the end of the world. They oftentimes don't actually have the goods. This feels a little different given the nature of the indictment document, but I will caution everybody, you got to be careful about going too far in that direction, because we have seen the FBI overplay its hand, no pun intended, on multiple occasions with these things in the past. Peter, let's go to you. What's your first question on all of this?
So you already kind of touched on it, but since the leagues have partnerships with these sports books, we already saw it in the Jonte Porter situation where they implemented a rule where there's no lines on two-way players for prop bets. Do you think there's a way to limit prop bets, or is it just way too much money for the sport? Way too much profit for these sports books?
Well, it's definitely profit for the sports books, but this is where, you have to think about wagering. It's not a federal thing. It's a state by state thing. This is actually a very similar conversation I have with people regarding NIL, where people treat NIL like it's some kind of national thing, and it's like, no, it's really dependent on state law. This is one of the curiosities of gambling in the United States, and this is where it'd be easier for everybody if we just had laws across the country. But as anybody who has tried to place a wager with an online app for a sports book knows, you have to download a different app if you go to a different state. So I do think that the issue you run into in terms of like trying to limit prop bets or limit the scope of them, you can do it. And this is where state governments and leagues have to say whatever the potential money might be, the potential loss of money and loss of reputation, for lack of a better term, that you might face with your league not being trustworthy in the eyes of bettors or just the general public probably isn't worth whatever money you're making. And so that's where, like, there's states where you can't make prop bets on college players, and that is, so it's clear that it can be done. I think the question here ultimately is the temptation for players to engage in behavior where they would, uh, they would say, okay, I'm going to tell friends of mine that this is a bet that they can make safely. I mean, that's always going to be there. And there's very little way to legislate that if you can legally wager on things. And, we've seen a lot of attempts at trying to make this so that it's not visible. There was that whole incident with the college baseball coach who was, letting his friend, who happened to be an Indiana native, know about things that he was supposed to bet on, and he was betting on them, and then he got caught. Like, this stuff is happening a lot more than I think people realize. And I don't think there's a good way to uncouple that, because as long as you've got human beings involved, there's always going to be the possibility that they will engage in behavior that would be forbidden because it's insider information. So you either have to get really limited in what you allow sports books to do, which they're not going to like, but you have to do it for the good of the league, or you try every time something like this happens to claim that it is an isolated incident. And I think you've only got so many get out of jail free cards that you can use as a league before people stop believing you. And, it's interesting that the NBA ends up being the place where you see a lot of this occurring. I don't believe they're the only ones that where it's happening, but it is interesting that it's like been pretty visible with the NBA, and it hasn't really been that visible with some of the other sports so far, at least not that we know of. But we've seen incidents in other sports as well. It's just like this one feels particularly dangerous for the league because of the fact that it also involves a coach. That's a level that we haven't really seen, I think, in some of the other sports at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. But do you think since the NBA is a five on, there's 10 people on the court instead of 18 or 22, that's a reason why we're seeing more, because they can influence the game more?
Sure. I mean, it's basketball has always been the easiest sport to affect in wagering. Like, baseball got all the press, the Black Sox scandal in 1919 and Pete Rose and whatnot. But realistically speaking, the fewer players you have out there, the more likely it is that somebody could do something that would affect the flow of a game in relation to the spread. And this is where, like, the most susceptible are like the individual sports like tennis or golf. But generally speaking, it's not part of the culture in the same way that it seems to be with basketball. And with basketball, if your team wins but you don't cover, most people don't bat an eye. Or if your team was already going to lose and you didn't cover your personal spread, in your prop bets, people aren't going to necessarily bat an eye unless there's abnormal gambling activity going on around that. But I do think that basketball seems more susceptible. And I don't really have a great understanding or explanation as to why from a cultural perspective. I do think that just realistically, though, if you're looking at that, there's a sweet spot between how many people are gambling on this and how easy is it to affect the outcome. There's a lot of research on soccer, global soccer, about match fixing and about gamblers and gambling syndicates being able to get to players in soccer. And we're not necessarily talking about the Premier League, although it has happened in the Premier League, but a lot of lower leagues. There's a really interesting book called The Insider's Guide to Match Fixing in Football, which is a book written by a journalist where he details all of these irregularities that they see in the betting markets in like the Singaporean league or the Indonesian league or the Thai league, where they've found that there's this very systematic approach in terms of prop bets and things relating to games. It's harder to affect soccer, but it's very much ingrained in the culture there. It being something that you would see in basketball is not surprising, and it's very hard to stop because it's very rare that you can clearly point out that someone is actually shaving points or doing something to negatively affect the outcome of the game, because there's so many things going on in the game, but there's still relatively few players. So it's a great question. I'm assuming that's the rationale, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think the reality is the prop bets are just so easy to manipulate from a player's perspective. When you have that inside information from a coach's perspective, anybody involved with the organization, it's far and away the easiest bet to manipulate and give information on and profit off of as a result. I think moving a different direction now, I think there's a more human conversation to be had because it's hard for us to understand from the outside just how people with so much money can get so deep into this, whether it's gambling, whether it's all of these different things, mafia related things, and lose so much money to be in a position where this is even something that they would think about. Like, why risk all of your career potentially going to jail when you already have so much money? So I want to get some of your thoughts on that. It's just from an outsider perspective, it's not really something that is easy for us to understand.
No, and I mean, I'm obviously not an athlete myself, so I'm just giving perspective based upon what I've read and what I've come to understand over the course of time. I think there's a couple of things. Like, having a lot of money doesn't mean that you're necessarily spending the money well. And there's tons of books, and there's a great documentary that was part of the 30 for 30 series called Broke, where you learn about how hard it can be for athletes to manage the money that they make. And a lot of times it's, you think about it, the way that sports has been organized up until now, up until the last couple of years, and it's changed a lot with NIL, where you can now make money. But historically, you're not making much money at all, in high school. You're oftentimes coming from a less advantaged background. You might get paid under the table at the collegiate level, but it's generally money that your parents are keeping, or you're only keeping part of it. You get to the league and you're making a lot of money, relatively speaking, but you're living amongst people who are making a lot more money, veterans and whatnot. You're seeing these lavish lifestyles. You've got a lot of people around you. It's like, if you ever read the advice that's given to people who win the lottery, like the first thing they advise you to do is to leave wherever you live immediately, like disappear for like a month, and don't tell anybody where you're at. Don't tell family, don't tell friends, because you now suddenly become a person that everybody wants to approach for money. And so it ends up being a situation where if you don't know how to handle the money, you don't have anybody you can trust, and you're also constantly being asked for money by the people in your life who feel like you're obligated to give them money. It can put you in a position where you spend through a lot of that money very quickly without a great plan. Sometimes it's not that altruistic. Sometimes you just blow it on stupid stuff. You go out and buy 3 cars, or you buy 2 homes, and like stuff you shouldn't be doing, but you don't realize it because the money's available and the credit lines are available. So some of the explanation could be, well, they're making money, but they're spending money, and so you need to make more money. Some of it might be, well, this is their way of of letting people who are in their lives make money off of them. You're not gambling on yourself, but if you can tell people that are affiliated with you, hey, I'm not going to hit my over today because I'm going to get injured. Well, that's one way of going about it. The mafia stuff's fascinating to me, and this is where I've yet to see a great explanation for this. But I will say, you'd be surprised the people you run into when you have a lot of money and you're in professional sports circles. And this is a long-standing issue. I mean, if you go back, if you're all familiar with the movie Goodfellas, which if you're not, you should go watch that. There's a whole 30 for 30 that was made off of one scene in Goodfellas, which was about the mob getting a bunch of basketball players at Boston College to start throwing games. They were making a ton of money off of that. Like the organized crime has always been around these spaces, and they look at it as a way to make money without really being directly in the line of fire. You're not having to stick up a bank. Who really loses, like in the big scheme of things, if a point spread goes one direction instead of another? It feels like a harmless kind of thing, but that can lead to other things. And, if you're told, hey, we'll give you 10 grand, hypothetically, to go be a front for this poker game, and, you're going to win, no problem. Nobody's really going to get hurt. We're going to get some people to come in and play poker with you. You're not thinking of that necessarily as being part of a crime scene. You're thinking of it as, well, I'm never going to get caught. I'm not doing anything wrong myself, even though I think clearly in this case, if the allegations are true, you are. But you tend to feel a little insulated in these things. And I think for a lot of this, it's less a moral decision, as you have kind of framed it, and more a matter of when you live in a particular world where there's a lot of money and a lot of situations where you feel pretty protected because of the people that you're working with, you're not going to think that you're in a position where you're going to get caught. And I honestly think that drives so much of what we see in these situations, is this idea that, well, I'm not even going to think about the implications of this. The chances of me getting caught are minimal. And I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier with that college sports indictment, where, we've seen programs and assistant coaches and head coaches paying players for years prior to NIL being in existence to get them to go play at particular schools. We know that. We've got it, there's documented evidence of it happening over and over again. You never think, I'm going to get arrested and go to jail for this. So I think you get lulled into a false sense of security until someone gets ripped off, goes and talks to the wrong people, for the wrong people for you, the right people for justice, as it would be. And now suddenly you find a bunch of people who are like, yeah, that guy was like the reason why we played in that poker game in the first place. And that's why we got scammed. And then you find out that, well, gosh, yeah, you are in the middle of something you weren't anticipating being in the first place. It's a psychology and a psychological circumstance that, frankly, I don't think the 99% of the population could ever get their heads wrapped around. But it's a situation that you can find yourself in that circumstance if you get associated with the wrong people.
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the ways that they do get caught now is because the sports books are legal, because now they have those partnerships that you mentioned earlier with the leagues. They share suspicious activity because it's beneficial to both parties. The leagues don't want their players betting on games and giving information, and the sports books want everything to be done legally so they can continue to operate. They can continue to make their own money.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'll reference Goodfellas again. It's my favorite movie of all time. And there's a line early on in the movie where Henry Hill is narrating, and it's one of the scenes where they're getting ready to bust out the bar. They're gonna have to burn the bar down because they've burned it as a business location. And he says something like, what Paulie and the organization do, and what the FBI could never figure out, is they provide protection for people that can't go to the police. And that's how the mafia, that's how organized crime has generally worked, at least in the United States. It is the place you go when you have an illegal operation that you can't go to police if you get ripped off. But you can go to the mob, and the mob will make sure you're taken care of. But the flip side is now you work for the mob, and that comes with a whole bunch of other conditions. In this case, I'll reference another Scorsese film, Casino, where if you watch, have either of you seen Casino?
Yeah.
Okay, we need a movie night for Nathan, clearly. But like in Casino, the mafia runs Las Vegas, and then it's eventually taken over by the corporations. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not illicit activity going on, but it means now it's being run as a more legitimate business, which changes the dynamic of things. And I think in this case, what you're dealing with is a situation where when sports books went from being something that only happened in Vegas or Atlantic City, or only happened, illegally behind the scenes, they went from being something where this was unregulatable, but oftentimes never caught, or if it was caught, it was dealt with behind the scenes. Now it has all these regulations that exist at the state level, at the federal level, that you have to deal with, and it complicates things. And there's a fascinating book that came out in the 80s by a guy, an author named Dan Mulday, which detailed what he had investigated as the ties between organized crime and the NFL. It's a fascinating book. Go read it. It never really got any publicity, which is kind of weird if you think about it. But there's a lot of historical ties between gambling, sports, and organized crime. And this is not a moral judgment. It's just a reality because it exists in other countries as well. I mentioned earlier, like we see it in soccer with different forms of organized crime and match fixing. So I think if you're in that world, it's easy to get tied up in that, not realizing that there are going to be some larger implications if the business goes legitimate, so to speak. And I think to some degree, whereas we saw the Donaghy scandal erupt when it wasn't the case, there's a lot more details now because now people feel compelled that they can go to the federal government to complain about this rather than it being something that you can't go to the federal government about because you were engaging in activity that itself was illegal. So how do you go complain to the cops about that?
Yeah. I want to go back to the Chauncey Billups situation. So he was allegedly tipping different, people saying that some of his guys were hurt. Do you think the way where I know there's, in the NBA especially, there's a lot of game time decisions. The NFL kind of implemented it where it was 90 minutes before the game time. You have to say everyone's healthy, everyone's not. Do you think there's a way in the NBA to implement a rule like that, or is it just too, just because the warm-ups are a big deal in the NBA? So is that too much of a big of a deal, or can you do something like that?
I mean, there was this whole scandal just in the last couple of days with Lamar Jackson and, him being on the injury report or not in the NFL. We just Brett McMurphy just wrote this piece, or as a tweet, I don't know if it was an actual piece, complaining about how coaches aren't taking the injury report seriously in college football. Well, why does anybody care? Right? I mean, other than gambling, coaches look at that and they say, most coaches, I think, are like, well, we're giving our opponent a competitive advantage by telling them that this player is not available and they can adjust rather than just rolling out and being like, oh, I guess they aren't playing this guy, or hey, that guy was healthy after all. I mean, I think you can eventually get to a point where you mandate it, but you have to take it entirely out of the coach's hands. And this is where I'm gonna use a completely non-gambling example that some people might not feel is appropriate, but I think it's illustrative of the problem here. Most coaches, we'll take Chauncey Billups and put him aside for the moment. Most coaches, I don't believe, are involved in this kind of thing. So they're looking at it as a competitive advantage or disadvantage thing. Why would we let the opposition, why would we let anybody know, opposition or whatever, that our guys are hurt and to what extent they're hurt? When all it does, the only reason you would do that is to help gamblers make decisions about who's going to play or not play in a game and therefore what bets they're going to make. Why should that be part of the equation I go through as a coach? I don't think anybody has a good answer for that. There is literally no reason for an injury report. The media doesn't care. If they claim that they care, they shouldn't care because you find out who's playing when they go out there and start playing, right? But I'm going to liken it to what the NFL and other leagues have had to do with concussions. So for the longest time, a coach is going to be like, well, if the guy says he can play, it should be my decision about whether he's playing or not. And I don't want anybody else out there. But that was leading to guys and girls too. But I mean, it was men and women both. It's not just limited to one gender. keeping themselves in games, even though they had a head injury, a brain injury that they needed to be attending to. And what the NFL eventually had to do was get an independent neurologist and put them on the sidelines and give them the authority to take a player out of the game, because coaches are not thinking in the heat of battle, gosh, I need to stop and make sure that this person is okay. Now, they've eventually started to move that direction, but you had to take the decision making entirely out of their hands. And so with injury reports, if they are really the things that we need, and we need them because of gambling, I think leaving it up to the coaches is not the right way to go about it. You need to have like an independent person in there observing these things and making notes about it, not leaving it in the hands of team personnel, because they're never going to look at it and say, this is something we need to be doing.
Yeah. I mean, I saw something where it said that they have kind of like shifted towards saying that like a training staff member would have to give the okay, but I know it's definitely not where
Who does the
where it
training staff
should be.
member work for is always what I say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it is moving in the right direction.
I mean, I think gradually, yes. It's just a matter of, do we get there? And eventually we do. But I do think you have to go back to that fundamental question. What is the league about? And this is not limited to the NBA. It's other sports as well. Is the league about wagering, or is the league about competition? Because if it's about competition, why would you make everybody do that? If it's about, if wagering's part of it, that's fine, but then you can't treat wagering like it's this completely separate thing that doesn't matter, which is what most of the leagues do with this stuff.
I agree. Nathan, got anything?
Well, I have to classify the wagering as something else because it's something they condemn for the people that they employ and all the players and all of that. So it's kind of like you want the good aspects, but you want to keep it off to the side so you don't have to deal with the repercussions.
Yeah, it's look, this is where it's funny because wagering has existed side by side with sports in most societies since the dawn of time. I mean, you walk down the street in England, there's betting kiosks all over the place, and you can go place wagers. That's been the case for a long time. In the United States, the reason wagering was banned early was not just like the scandals, but there was a real morality issue with wagering. And the idea was, we want to keep that away from the game because it affects the integrity of the game. But it's also one of those things that you can't get away. I remember the first time I became aware of how big this market was. And it was back I was teaching at the University of Miami. It was either 2007 or 2008. I think it was 2007. And there was an NFL game between the Chargers and the Steelers. And I think the Chargers had scored at the very tail end of the game, and they were leading, but they hadn't covered. I think they were leading by 2, and the spread was like 4. And then the Steelers, on the last kickoff of the game, engaged in a series of laterals, and one of them got dropped and picked up by the Chargers player and run into the end zone. And suddenly the Chargers covered. And this was a big kerfluffle because it swung the betting line so heavily the other direction. And I was talking with someone who's an expert in sports wagering. This is back in 2007 when he didn't talk about sports wagering. And he was like, that probably swung $600 million in revenue. And I'm like, that seems excessive. And he's like, no, this was back in 2007. He's like, there is probably, and this is in an illegal market with only Vegas being the place where you could wager legally, there's probably $1 billion wagered on each NFL game each week. And, that's like $16 billion every week. And it's like, really? This was a revelation to me. It probably shouldn't have been, but I was still learning at that point. But think about how big the market is now, and think about the sheer amount of money that changes hands on very basic things. And then you think about the amount of money that's being poured into media by wagering, whether it's Barstool, whether it's ESPN now with their partnership with Penn, whether it's any of the books. Like, there is so much money at stake, and it all centers around the competition around these games. And there's people playing these games, and there's people coaching these games. And eventually, the threat of I'm going to get caught is less than the reward of not getting caught and doing something that can help you out financially and not directly impact what you think is important about the game. Because, like, if you're a player, you theoretically care about winning or losing the game. If you're a coach, you care about winning or losing. You don't care about the spread. And so that's where I think, because of the weird lack of, like, the incentive structures are always what I come back to. What are the incentives for winning and losing? What are the incentives for not engaging in wagering versus engaging in wagering? And if the incentives for not doing it are outweighed by the incentives for taking part of it, thinking you're not going to get caught, more people are going to go for the latter. That's just human nature. And that, it's no different than corruption in government, which is another thing that organized crime tends to do. Like, if I'm a judge and I get paid a lot of money to rule a certain way, and it doesn't really materially hurt anything, if it's like a white collar crime or whatever, like, what benefit? I have to have a really strong moral compass to not only say, well, I don't care about the outcome, but I'm going to turn the money down. And I just tend to think we're at a point right now with sports where there's so many financial incentives in favor of supporting whatever is going to be best for the companies that are engaged in marketing or brokering the wagers, that it makes it very hard for somebody to be like, I'm not going to get involved in this at all, because why not? Like, what benefits are you getting by not getting involved, especially if there's people around you that are benefiting from being involved? That's a really tough spot to put somebody in.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's everywhere you look, you see there's a sports book ad. So
yeah,
even on the ESPN, when they broke the news, it's ESPN bet right in the bottom corner.
Yeah, and that
They
looks
caught
bad.
that one.
Yeah, it looks bad. The optics are terrible. But the flip side is, people didn't boycott ESPN for it, right? Like, people didn't delete their sports apps or sportsbook apps. And I just want to clarify for anybody watching this, I'm not condoning any of this behavior, but I am trying to give an accounting and an explanation for the human nature element of why people do this. Because I think that's what everybody's asking. I mean, the question you guys asked earlier about, if you have all that money, why would you risk it? And it's like, I just don't think people think that way. Like, it's easy for people who don't have money to say, why would you think that way? But when you have money, or if you're in a position where you can get access to money, your value judgments change. I'm not saying they should, but I am saying that they do. So anyway, any final thoughts on this, guys? Well, I'm curious how you feel. You're both in college. You both cover sports. You're both familiar with the sports landscape. And Peter, let me start with you and then move to Nathan. Like, I'm old, and I've seen a lot of stuff. And I'm curious what your perspective on all of this is. I think that's the key to me.
I mean, I'm from New York, so I see, every corner of every block, there's a bookie around. It's hard to get around. I mean, it's hard. A lot of my friends are involved with, obviously betting. I bet here and there. It's, especially when it's so accessible to everyone. I don't understand why, because they have so much money, but it is right in front of you. So that's my take on it. I mean,
yeah,
it's tough. I got one more thing. On a document, it said Chauncey Billups' nickname was Chum, which is like fish bait for
right.
poker games. I don't know if you guys saw that. I was cracking up at that earlier today.
The Mafia does a great job of setting nicknames. I will give them that. But yeah, no, I mean, but that's the gig, And look, I mean, again, like I've always been fascinated by organized crime in the United States. I'm half Italian. I had distant members of the family that were involved in that area, and I was fascinated as to why. Because I had the other half of the family was in the military, and it's like you can't get any further apart than that. It feels like, but I'm always fascinated by the approaches that are taken and the way that these things are undertaken, and this idea of these are sophisticated types of things. They're like they can be confidence scams in a way, to some degree, in a different way of looking at it. Like, it's interesting because what lures people in is the idea I'm going to go play poker with a former NBA player. And then it's not above board, but that's a real allure to a lot of people. And I think that whole psychological process around how you utilize people in these environments, if true, again, all of these are just allegations, but if true, it's a fascinating insight to me into human psychology and how people process the things in front of them and what their incentive structures are. So I don't know, Nathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, as Peter said, I have less experience with it in person, not walking around New York every day, seeing the bookies around. But for me, it's more as a viewer of sports, as a sports fan. There was a study that was done where they took account of all the gambling logos and ads that were seen during the Stanley Cup Finals and the NBA Finals this past year. And it was every 13 seconds you see a gambling logo or a gambling ad. It's impossible to consume sports content anywhere without being bombarded with ads for DraftKings and FanDuel and all the other sports books and being encouraged to gamble your own money on that. And I think there does need to be more regulations around it because I think it's become predatory for people and it poses a large danger financially to sports fans. And I don't think that's the kind of message that leagues should be sending to their own fans.
It's an interesting point. And, this is where I try to keep the following things in mind. Like, there's a ton of people who wager because it's fun and because they are responsible with it and because they don't really care about sports that much, but they do care about wagering. This is something I try to, remind students about that are interested in working in sports and sports media. Most of those people are legitimate sports fans that are students that are trying to go that direction. And you could make an argument that there's a large number of people, maybe not a majority, but perhaps a large minority of people for whom the sports aren't that important, but the wagering is. And that's tough sometimes for people who are sports fans to get their heads wrapped around because they assume that everybody's watching it for the same reasons that they are. And that's not always the case. I also think it's worth noting that all the indictments in this they appear to be tied to illegal activities regarding sports wagering or wagering in general, if you want to get into the poker games, although even those weren't illegal. The games themselves weren't illegal.
Games are legal, yeah.
But the way they were conducted was illegal. But this is where I think you have to keep in mind that there are people for whom this is an addiction. It's something that can develop into an addiction. It's something that can be financially dangerous. And right now what we're seeing is this attempt at a gold rush, so to speak, by wagering companies to try to grab market share. And it's not a whole lot different than any other businesses that are trying to grab market share. And that's why you're getting bombarded with these ads. Now, I don't think that'll be that way forever. I think I already feel like we're hitting kind of a saturation point where you're not getting a huge amount of new signups. You're like the tenor of the ads around sports wagering have changed. It's less about onboarding people and it's more about either maintaining people or trying to steal people from what they're already wagering with. But I do think that there's a backlash, particularly among your generation, about this because for my generation and for millennials, this was something you had to do illicitly. If you were going to wager, you'd have to wager with a bookie or you'd have to wager on an offshore account. And that made it like dangerous and fun to some people in a way that it's not if you can just download the app on your phone and do it while you're sitting in chemistry class or wherever you happen to be. And I do think for a lot of people, the constant overselling of sports wagering as part of the experience is having the opposite effect of what is desired, where people are getting burned out by the idea of wagering being tied into everything. Most of the, all these content pieces that we're seeing that are so prevalent, where people are picking spreads, and you've got whole shows that are devoted just to gambling. It's more of a niche thing. The closest thing I can compare it to is like when I graduated undergrad, which was 25 years ago, and was working in the field, and then I was in master's program. that was when the poker boom happened. And it's like you couldn't turn on television without ads for like online poker or Poker Stars or something with No Limit Hold'em. And there were television like programs around poker everywhere, and it was just so central. And it burned out because after a while, all the people that were ever interested in playing poker or wagering on poker, we found them. And we found there wasn't that big of a market. Like what I'm fascinated by is ESPN in particular has placed such a huge wager on gambling and the money from gambling from the book that they now co-own being the revenue source that they need to replace all the money they've lost from cable subscriptions that have died out over the last 10, 15 years. And I don't know if it's going to work for them. Like, I think I think they joined too late. By the time they got into the mix, there were FanDuel already existed and DraftKings already existed and Caesars already existed and MGM already existed. It's like after a while, there's no more market share and it starts to shrink. So it's funny you mentioned the bombardment of ads. It's like we're trying to squeeze as much blood out of the turnip as possible. And after a while, there's nothing else that's going to come out. Like we've gotten all the people we're going to get. And then you start to lose people because they realize that A, they're not very good at wagering. B, they've lost money at it. And C, it's like, I'm not going to throw more money at that. You run out of people pretty quickly going that direction.
Yeah, I feel like it's like a two-headed race between FanDuel and DraftKings. So everyone else that joined, it might be a little bit too late. There's such a huge margin with those two and the rest that I don't know if they're I don't know.
And I might be getting the numbers wrong, but I remember seeing some documents from ESPN when they did the Penn Live thing, when they took that from Barstool, where they were anticipating within 5 years they were going to have like a quarter of the U.S. betting market. That's not happening at this point. Like the numbers just don't add up. And even if they get to that, which I don't think they will, that's going to be a quarter of a much smaller piece of the pie than it was in 2023.
That is true.
So
ESPN Bet has a whole other conversation after their deal with the NFL about the logistics of that and the, ethical fallout of the NFL having a stake in a company that profits from gambling on their league. It's kind of maybe could pose some problems similar to the NBA for the NFL in the future. Well,
and I mean, the piece that doesn't get talked about with that is that even the league's data to sell? Like, doesn't that belong to the players, at least in part? I mean, that's because a lot of the wagering stuff and a lot of the reason why the sports books want to get in directly tied to the leagues is because they want the data so that they can do a better job of making decisions about what lines they're setting. It's funny because like the way that sports wagering used to work and still does to some degree, but the best sports books were the ones with the best handicappers. And this is again where like the fundamental misconception of how wagering works comes into play, where it's not about getting a bunch of people to lose money on bets. It's about a bunch of people placing bets because what you're making money off of is the VIG. You're making money off of the commission that you're taking off of each bet. You're not making money off of people winning or losing. You're making money off of people betting. That number has to keep going up. If it doesn't keep going up, you've got a real problem in terms of your revenue flow. And I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out right now. And there's no good answers because the leagues, frankly, are not prepared to deal with this and the fallout. And colleges are certainly not ready and prepared to deal with the fallout of all of this, which I think is why most of their membership was like, hey, maybe we should stop the idea that we're going to let everybody wager on pro sports. That might have some unintended consequences. So anyway,
sure.
Guys, a rousing conversation on a bunch of topics. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope it was enjoyable for you guys as well.
It was awesome.
Of course.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. A little different than our normal programming, but I figure we need a slight respite just to kind of catch our breath as we head into November, as we'll have plenty to talk about with the stuff we normally talk about on the Back Home Network. So anyway, Peter Maiorano, Nathan Shriberg, you can catch them on Big Red Carpet every Monday as they work with Rhett Lewis, talking about IU football and working through what's going on with all of that. Guys, thank you so much for taking part in this. And thanks to all of you folks out there for, as always, being a part of the audience for the Back Home Network. I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining me. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.